going to go ahead and call this work session to order on two ordinances, AO 2019-66 and AO 2019-67. Very briefly, before we continue, I forgot one note on the last work session we had on the climate action plan. Next week, as the members probably saw, we have another work session planned, and that is to review some amendments from two groups. A climate action group that has some suggested amendments to the plan, and an elementary school class that has a suggested amendment to the plan. So that'll be next week. Now focusing on this one, brief introduction before I turn it over to the team. I just wanted to give a brief intro to explain how we got here. So after the Marijuana Control Board finally passed their regulations regarding on-site and the Lieutenant Governor signed them, the Community and Economic Development Committee began reviewing a proposal to allow on-site consumption. They had 4 meetings in April, April 4th, 11th, 18th, and 25th. During that first meeting on April 4th, I introduced the concept of bifurcating the issue, that is to tackle edibles first and then inhalation after. The reason I did this was basically time. I wanted to see if we could get regulations passed in place for this summer season to help our local businesses, and I knew inhalation would take a much longer time, including Planning and Zoning Commission review and a lengthy public process. So now we are here, and now I want to turn it over to the team.
Do you need to roll call or anything?
Yes, we do, thank you. We'll go ahead and start with Ms. Kennedy.
Mr. Kennedy.
Lee Peters.
Big Don.
Don Meadow. Cameron Perez-Verdia.
Felix Rivera.
Chris Judy. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Assistant Council.
Ryan Yale, Planning Department. And Chris Judy, Director of Economic Community Development.
Mr. Chair, Chris Constant on the phone.
Great, thank you, Mr. Constant.
Great, thank you, Barbara. We're going to do just a real quick introduction to the two ordinances that are in front of the body right now, both of which deal with on-site consumption. And I can't see the back table, but I assume there are copies of both of them back there. Okay, good, there are. We're going to start just by giving the readers a quick summary of what's in both, and I'm going to start with AO 2019-66. This is the licensing or Title 10 ordinance. There are a lot of sections and a lot of pages in there, and I think for the casual reader that may seem daunting, but we've prepared a quick summary of what's in the document by section. The majority of it is simply adding this new on-site consumption endorsement, which is not a new license, but is an addition to a retail license. That gets added and inserted throughout the code in provisions dealing with everything from application, renewal, transfers, protests, etc. There's a couple of sections that we're going to highlight because they are unique or different or new. And I'm going to start with section 3. One of the big change, or one of the little changes that we're making with this ordinance that isn't directly related to on-site consumption is just to codify what is the current practice for marijuana retail licenses, or any license really, when it comes to the municipality. The way code was originally drafted, it was envisioned that all new applications, license applications, would go through the clerk's office. Through the past couple of years, trial and error, we've learned that the majority of the work actually ends up in the lap of the planning department, and they have been the de facto intake point ever since. We're just simply codifying that now. The other section that I'd like to highlight is section 8 and section 9. Section 8 I'm highlighting only because it ensures that on-site consumption endorsements are part of the public participation process, meaning that anyone can participate in the discussion or debate around these endorsements. And then section 9, we do require a public hearing for our endorsements, and we have expanded the buffer or radius, if you will, for notification of those public hearings to 1,000 feet compared to 500 feet for other license types. So those two are worth highlighting. Continuing on, the other meaty section of this first ordinance is section 15. Section 15 is really the heart, it's all new code, and it's really the heart of adding edibles as a product that can be consumed on site. Establishes the characteristics of the consumption area, has the criteria for the operating plan for anyone who wishes to operate an on-site consumption endorsement, or get an on-site consumption endorsement, and then also has specifics on things like repackaging, destroying property, or destroying product, unused, labeling, things like that.
I want to note for the record really quick, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you. Section 16 I'll also highlight because it introduces the concept of overconsumption. Now that we're dealing with consumption on premise, that we have to deal with overconsumption. It also talks about a prohibition on intoxicated or drunken individuals being allowed in. Section 17 establishes the daily limits on quantities that can be sold. Obviously that ties back to the overconsumption provisions. And then the remainder of these are simply additions of the on-site consumption endorsement to these violations and suspension procedures. Moving on, the other section that I think is interesting or of note is Section 25. Section 25 is just definitions, but it's an important section because throughout the document where we're referring to certain things like consumption or overconsumption, you need a definition of what that is, and we've provided those at the end of the document. In the second big stack of paper, this is AO 2019-67. These are the Title 21 changes. Much shorter document. I can blow through this pretty quickly. The majority of it is simply adding on-site consumption endorsement to existing land use and zoning processes. The one to highlight is Section 4. This is the requirement that there be one parking space per 100 square foot of on-site consumption space. This is not over and above what is required for the retail store. If you have a retail store that's 100 square feet and suddenly you want to have a 50 square foot consumption area, you have actually shrunk your retail square footage. So your parking requirements for the retail store will go down. Conversely, as you add space, it goes up again at a similar, at actually the exact same rate, right? Comparable rate for adding the on-site consumption. And then the only other thing I'll highlight is Section 7. This was something that was a consensus of the Community and Economic Development Committee and staff. These changes to Title 21 did not require review by Planning and Zoning Commission. So that's the gist of those two ordinances by section. At a very high level, we're going to talk about what this proposes. So we're only proposing that marijuana consumption be allowed within a licensed marijuana retail establishment, and it will be limited to edibles, as Chair Rivera pointed out in the beginning. Smoking or inhalation are not included at this time. The product can be consumed by customers within that consumption area. However, any product that's left over at the end must be properly repackaged if it's going to be removed from the premises or destroyed by the licensee. Other consumable products, i.e. coffee or soda, can be sold in the consumption area. They just cannot contain marijuana or alcohol. And then marijuana handler permit, of course, required for all employees and licensees. And this is important because that helps provide training to staff to identify when someone is impaired or has overconsumed. Do you want to do the consumption area? Or you want to keep rolling?
Sure. So the marijuana consumption area will only be allowed within an existing licensed marijuana retail sales establishment. So either it's going to be an approved marijuana retail sales establishment that is then modifying their floor plan to add a consumption area, or it will be a brand new application that we see for a new retail sales establishment that is applying for an on-site consumption endorsement. So it has to be isolated from other areas of the retail store, separated by walls and a secure door, and it can only be accessible from the retail store. There can't be a back door where people can come in unchecked. Currently in the regs, they do have to provide a smoke-free area for employees to monitor the area. We had touched on this before, that monitoring could be accomplished through the use of video surveillance. But because we're not allowing smoking or consumption by inhalation at this time, it's sort of a weak point in the regulations. And a separate ventilation system to direct air to the outside with filters to remove visible smoke from the main border and property line are required. So this really gets kicked in if consumption by inhalation becomes legal. However, at this time, odor is not really an enormous concern for us with edibles. It's very similar to if you walk into a bakery or a candy shop, which you just smoke the product, you don't necessarily smell
just real quick, there's the on-site consumption licensing process, which is detailed both in the existing code and in the ordinance. This is a quick summation of that. The on-site consumption endorsement is a secondary or supplemental process, so there are a number of steps that they have to go through to secure this endorsement, summarized here. For anyone with an existing retail license, this is the chain for that, and it's very similar as well. This is just for a quick high-level understanding. At any rate, at this point, that's a quick high-level review of the two ordinances, and we can hit the lights, and we're available for questions or discussion.
Okay. So before we get to questions, which I assume there are some, I just want to outline the plan for this ordinance. So this is our first of 2 work sessions on the ordinance. We have a second work session planned on the 17th, and that one is to tackle in granular detail any remaining questions that we don't resolve at this work session, which I imagine there will be some. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions. Yeah, Ms. Alton.
I just wanted to make sure everyone understood that we're only talking about on-site consumption with regard to standalone locations. I keep hearing a lot of concern about like storefronts. So I just wanted to highlight that because that's a couple of comments I've got. Well, we'll be in a storefront with lots of other things where there would be on-site consumption. And my understanding is that's not true. That it has to be a standalone retail facility or establishment.
Correct. Through the chair, that's correct. From the state regulations, on-site consumption is only allowed in a freestanding retail establishment.
Regardless if it's inhale or whatever.
Correct.
Thank you, Ms. Alton. Mr. Weddleton.
I think we should flesh that out because, freestanding people think, I have this building and there's nothing connected to it. It's just sitting in a parking lot. If you're downtown, it could be it's one building that shares a wall. That would be considered freestanding. But if you're in a strip mall, one unit strip mall, that would not be freestanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair, that's approximately correct. Party walls technically are not freestanding buildings, but in downtown Anchorage, there are very few party walls. Party wall is where the 4 walls of your neighbor, one of their 4 walls is one of yours too. Typically, more often what's the case is you just have walls that are butted up very close to each other in downtown. But your example of strip malls or industrial bays is spot on.
What if that's clear? The party wall means not freestanding. Do people understand that?
Yes. How, Peter, are you looking at me?
I'm looking at Ms. Welty.
Jan Welty, yeah, how Chris described it is how I understand it. I think it's how most of the industry understands it. I'm not sure how the public understands it. There may be some confusion with downtown, but that's our understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Yes, Mr. Presverdia.
Is there a requirement for a differentiation between the products that are sold for consumption and products that are sold for consumption outside of the facility?
Through the chair, that's a good question. I don't think that we've looked at that level of detail on the licensing side or on the Title 21 side, but because the code is very specific about prohibitions on concentrates and inhalation or smoking products, it would seem to me that anything that's edible is fair game.
Thank you, Mr. Presverdia. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, following up on that, in terms of what the code requires for labeling, as far as, and I'm not familiar with, actually, could you say what the code requires for labeling? So, for example, if there's something that has a very high concentration, that will be clear, and then if someone is consuming that, the person who is monitoring knows, what has been consumed in terms of concentration.
Through the chair, that's absolutely correct. So all of the edible products do label the amount of THC content, and it's based on milligrams.
Jenna Waltine again, sorry. So actually it's physically separated in the state regulations. It has to be a separate point of sale, so you can only buy in the on-site area prepackaged amounts that are the limit. right? Or single servings. You can't have the regular 10 packs of up to 50 milligrams over in the on-site area. That's not allowed, so it's totally different point of sale under the state regs.
Has to be a separate POS.
Totally separate.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
So, just so I understand correctly, that would mean when someone is in an on-site consumption area, they can only buy single servings, which are limited to how much THC?
So they could buy a single serving or 2 servings, which are each serving is limited at 5 milligrams. And some of the servings are less, like there's microdose mints that are 2.5 milligrams. So I'm sure those will be available too in the on-site area. And so it's totally separate, walled off, separate entrance.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Weddleton.
This might not be, would not be an issue for edibles, but if you get into inhalation, if you're saying you're selling within the on-site area, you can't have an employee within, you can't require employees to be if they're smoking. So you can't sell within the on-site area.
So my understanding is that you can have an employee and they're selling it, but if they're supposed to be monitoring people's consumption levels, they have to have a place that they can go that's away from the smoke. That gets back to the security idea. The security camera viewing. And there is a new ordinance or regulation project that's out for public comment from the Marijuana Control Board, and public comment ends June 19th, I believe, June 19th. It cleans up a couple items in the original language for the state regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
So I'm just clarifying, you said earlier that the entrance into the section that is the area to consume has to come through the retail store. So you have to enter through the retail store. But we're learning that it would be a different point of sale. So I would enter through the retail store, I would then enter into the consuming area, and then I would only be able to purchase my consuming marijuana in that area, consume it in that area. And so so it's separate. So if I wanted to purchase to take some home, then I would go into the other area and purchase it. Is that right? Is that what I'm understanding?
Wait,
Oh, go ahead.
through the chair, so say you ordered a cookie and you didn't eat all of it. You can take that home with you, but it has to be repackaged in accordance with the packaging standards before you're able to remove it from the consumption area. So, but yes, if you were to go in to just buy a cookie and to not consume much, like to take home with you, you just go to the retail space.
And through the chair, the code, the ordinance in front of you sets the daily limit not to exceed 10 milligrams. And I'm unaware of there being a set limit on you can only buy 2 5s. I think as long as it doesn't add up to more than 10, there's no limit on the individual pieces you buy, provided the individual dosages don't add up to more than 10. But I'll also admit that the requirement for a point of sale inside the consumption area is new to us. But I guess it could work.
And I'm going to double check that just to make sure I was correct.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdia. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you. I'm hoping that we can backtrack a little bit just for some historical perspective, because I feel like this is a train that is already way down the track. And, I absolutely realize that the state has approved the sale and purchase of marijuana, and we've gone down that track to the point of allowing it here, but it was still under, I'm under the impression that it is still within a municipality or borough's purview to decide what that's going to look like, or even if. So, because where I guess was the decision made that we were going to pursue this part of sales or marijuana purchase, if we had limited, was this just a decision made all along that we were going to go down and just completely do all of this? Was it just done because the state had done the regulations? Was this community driven? How did we get here to the point of going to this kind of detail to basically permitting it?
So I can go ahead and take that question on. So I wasn't here when they first crafted the original ordinance, but in that original ordinance, they did have some reserved spots in the law, assuming that this would be a discussion that we had as a community down the road after the state decided to pass its regulations. So if you look at the current code, it does have that reserved. What happened a few months ago when the state finally started deliberating and finally did pass its regulations, then I can only speak for myself, but I did talk to the administration and I said, okay, the state has passed its regulations, and I want to see if we can move forward with on-site consumption. And that led to the creation of these draft documents, and now we're here in the middle of a lengthy public process to deliberate
Mr.
if we
Chair.
actually want to go through this or not. And I think I hear that Mr. Constant might want to add a little bit onto this.
Yep.
Sure, go ahead.
That just approximately a year or 18 months ago,
Okay.
the Assembly passed a resolution communicating to the AMCO board that we have an interest in the question of regulating on-site consumption. And it came up particularly because in the downtown, we have a number of people who are visitors and who can't find a place to use, so they're using our parks, and it's creating some conflicts. And so the Assembly previously communicated to AMCO its interest in this as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was so long ago that I forgot about it. But this has been a discussion the community has had for, as Mr. Constant states, a little over a year. Did you have any further follow-up, Ms. Kennedy? Thank you. Mr. Presverdia.
I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I'm interested in hearing from the Anchorage Police Department in the room about where we are in terms of the ability to test for people who are intoxicated by marijuana, and sort of where we are in our ability to enforce that, and if there is something that they are aware of in the future that may be coming that will allow us to test that better than we are doing now.
And thank you. And actually, before you respond, so I know we have APD here, and I think we have the health department here. Are there any other municipal departments in the room? Okay, so just the members are aware we have those two departments. Go ahead.
Sure. My name is Lieutenant Richard Enning. I'm the lieutenant for the Traffic and the Impaired Driver Enforcement Unit. And because we have a lot of people who work for us with more expertise than I brought Officer Steve Dunn. He's one of my fatality investigators. He is also a drug recognition expert, and he has been one since 2004. He's one of the first ones that we've had in the state. And I will let Officer Dunn answer those questions since he's much more qualified than I am.
Thank you. I've been in the department about 22 years. I've been at Erie since 2004. And I get involved in cases where those folks have been arrested for impaired driving. And either there's no alcohol on board, just drugs and medication, or low levels of alcohol, under an 08, and there's drug and medication on board. So basically I do an evaluation. Based on the evaluation, I look for clinical signs that supports what I'm seeing as far as impairment. Different drugs will produce different type of clinical signs that we look for. So based on our evaluation, we can now actually better prosecute these folks for impaired driving, because we don't have a per se limit. A lot of states have a per se limit, like an 08. If you're an 08 alcohol, you're intoxicated. It doesn't matter who you are. Other states have a THC per se limit, and we don't have that. So with the Erie program, we're actually better able to prosecute these folks to show that, hey, these officers saw the impairment, they made the arrest, they do a 000. Now that you came in, saw all these clinical signs to support the impairment, and then we either ask for blood or we get a search from the blood, and then blood toxicology will support that, hey, this is what the officer saw. So based on that, we've grown to have now 12 degrees at the police department. We get called out on those specific cases, but I can tell you that my job, current job as a traffic fatality investigator, which I've been in for some time now, the marijuana percentage, as far as percentage of folks that are fatals or when it comes to our office, has grown greatly. And I'll give you a great example. Last year, 2018, we had a total of 34 cases that came to our office. Out of the 34 cases, 24 of those were fatals. Out of 24 of those fatals, 11 were THC related. So we got 46% of those cases are THC related And my concern with the edibles is that now you have a source where folks are consuming marijuana, and with edibles, it's not like smoking it, where it actually gets into your system quickly and it dissipates quickly. And there's studies out there that show that dissipation of marijuana is really quick out of the blood system. Now with edibles, there's a delayed response because now it has to go through your digestive system to get into your bloodstream. So once you consume it, you leave it half an hour or whatever, and to the point where now the THC has taken effect in your body. That's going to be a great concern. And particularly with edibles now, folks at home that are going to consume edibles at home most likely will stay home. So now you have a location where you're inviting folks to come in, and who's to say that they're going to go to this source and consume their 10 milligrams, and then go to the next one and consume another 10 milligrams. So it's going to compound the effect. And I can see, just last year how much THC has been a factor in our fails.
Thank you. So I have Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Peterson, Ms. Solotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have several questions going back to the actual on-site consumption location in the handlers. Is that the correct term? Okay. For the folks who would be in that area. As far as training goes, is that somewhere in here, and what kind of training would be required? And
through the chair, the marijuana handler's permit training is handled by the state, or I guess by a contractor of the state, similar to the way that the TAM card is issued for employees of liquor establishments.
okay, so that would be totally handled by the state. And I had a couple more questions.
Sure.
Actually, to the folks from APD, I have similar questions to what Mr. Perez-Verdia has brought up, and was wondering initially how, in terms of DUI arrests, it breaks down between alcohol and marijuana. And I think I heard you say 46% of the DUI arrests?
Of the fatals.
Oh, the fatals, okay. Fatalities. Do you know the number in just general, how many arrests related to marijuana versus alcohol?
Well, I've got some, ma'am, Lieutenant Henning again. I've got some numbers from March, and between APD's regular patrol staff and our ID unit, we had 145 DUI arrests in March. About through the IDEU unit, we had 75 of those arrests. I can talk to numbers on the IDE unit, but not department-wide. We're collecting those numbers right now. But excuse me, of those 74 arrests, about a quarter to a third involved a search warrant for blood, which indicates there were drugs involved.
Okay, so a quarter to a third for something other than alcohol?
Correct, and that's where they would either blow a 000 or blow way below their visible signs of impairment, where we would say, oh, there's something else on board here. That does not take into account, a lot of our cases we have signs of poly drug use, more than one drug use. So it doesn't take into account the folks that are obviously impaired on alcohol and might have something else on board, because if they blow a .08, we run with the alcohol-related OUI, not the drug impaired side of it. So that's a rough number.
So my concern,
Mr. Chair, go ahead.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I have a couple more questions. So my concern would be on the prosecution side, because in terms of field sobriety tests, I understand those are all based on alcohol. And while I understand too that officers can judge impairment, when it comes to documentation, it's based on federally funded tests mostly, I believe, to determine sobriety. And so I would ask then, what are the, when it comes to convictions, how does that play out? I mean, it's my understanding it's not really successful as far as convicting based on marijuana impairment. Can you add to that?
Actually, they have. We have two prongs of DUI law. One is an 08 per se, but another is impairment. And based on the impairment side of it, if those folks that are stopped and they conduct field sobriety tests, and field sobriety test is actually not specific to alcohol. It's just for a way for us to look at impairment. It's psychophysical, or I guess by attention, pretty much is how the field sobriety tests are developed. And based on that, we determine if the subject or the driver is impaired, then they make the arrest. As far as prosecution, if they're prosecuted on the per se theory, then we have to show that, okay, this person displayed bad driving. During personal contact, we saw indications of impairment, and during the field sobriety test, we saw impairment as well. Therefore, we made the arrest, and then we have get a DEA involved, and then we get toxicology, and the toxicology comes back to show that there's drugs and medication, or in this case, marijuana. Then that is a strong case where they actually prosecute these convictions for impaired driving just based on drugs in general.
And just a clarification, Mr. Chair, if possible, if you could or somebody would be able to provide those statistics on convictions. And I will say, a couple years ago, I did serve on a jury for an impairment case, and I was surprised at the difficulty, and everything had lined up in this particular case, and I was surprised at the difficulty in how the individual was not convicted on any charges, yet from the prosecution and law enforcement side, it was considered a very strong case. And that's exactly my concern with folks who consume and drive. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I had some questions for the health department, but maybe I could come back later because I know others are in the queue.
Okay, I'll put you on the bottom of the queue. Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm wondering, I've heard that they've been trying to develop a test similar to a test that they give on the road for someone they pulled over for a DUI that can tell whether the marijuana has been consumed today or yesterday or the day before. Because the problem, what I've been told, is that once you smoke the marijuana, the stuff stays in your system a lot longer than alcohol does. And so it's been difficult for them to tell whether the person had done it recently or the day before or a few days earlier.
Right. I guess the bottom line is we're looking for impairment, and there are indicators where other officers have been trained to in drug recognition to recognize some of the signs of cannabis consumption. One of which is eyelid tremors, which is not typical officer would administer, or leg tremors, because it affects large muscle groups. And I mean, just based on that, we're really looking at the bottom line is impairment. If you see the impairment on the psychophysical test, on the like the walk and turn, the one leg stand, things like that, and as far as specific tests only for marijuana, if they're a polydrug user, we're going to see, like, a good example would be somebody that drinks alcohol and they smoke marijuana. We're going to see some of the indicators of alcohol consumption, but we're also going to see indicators of marijuana consumption. So what do you go with? You have to go with impairment. So when they do the field sobriety test, we're really just looking for impairment in general.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. And did the health department want to add anything onto that?
That's not an area that.
Okay, great. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for APD and one back to Mr. Schutte. Do we have the same statistics that you mentioned regarding traffic-related incidents where THC impairment was involved from before legalization, so we can compare?
Are you looking at traffic fatalities or just DUI arrests in general?
Both, so that we can kind of look at whether legalization has played, potentially played any role, because what I'm hearing is concern that consumption outside of the home may play a role, but I'm kind of just curious how much illegal consumption outside of the home may already be taking place.
Right, that's a great point. The statistic I quoted there just for our 2018 cases would certainly go back to 17, 16, and so on, just to see what type of, as far as toxicology you have back, whether it's marijuana involved or not. We can start looking at that.
That'd be great, thank you. And the question I have is, have we considered throughout the development of these of phasing implementation geographically, perhaps starting with downtown and pushing it out further?
Through the chair, no. The only phasing that was discussed by the committee was the phasing of the consumption types, so edibles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Curious on hours of operation. Is it the same or different as it relates to the on-site
Are you asking if the on-site consumption have the same hours as the retail?
Is there any difference?
It's all the same.
And then a clarification on what else can be served. What else can be served in the consumption area in terms of things that they can consume?
So that's found on page 10 of 19, lines 11 and 12. It's very broad. It says food or beverages not containing marijuana or alcohol.
Okay, so there is currently not an ability to have a co-license where you could have an alcohol facility and a consumption.
Through the chair, no, those are prohibited.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a question back for APD on the topic of this pretty scary sounding increase of testing, or at least maybe not increase, but the number. Would you do us all a favor and go back through your 75 cases, I think it was, you said that you had, and identify which ones were the only product that came back tested was marijuana, and then which ones were the poly drug use, so that we can have a benchmark, because correlation and causation are clearly two distinct things.
Lieutenant Henning again. Yeah, we can run those numbers. The ones from March are not going to be accurate or up to date, just simply because toxicology takes a while. But I can.
Yeah, how about you pick a time frame that works for you, and maybe if we can, we'll look at it year over year going back. But yeah, you pick a time and just make it reasonable.
Yep, we're in the process of working on those stats already. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. LaFrance.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, to add to that, as far as prosecutions, would that be something through the chair that would come through like the legal department, Mr. Sherwood, or?
Through the chair, we can check with our prosecution division. I don't know if they keep those kind of statistics in terms of this particular OUI case involved a marijuana-only impairment or marijuana alcohol, but I can ask and see what they have.
Thank you. And a couple other questions, Mr. Chair, and one to Mr. Schutte, and this may be in there. In terms of last call, how long before the establishment closes is that done? I mean, how much time would be provided for someone to hang out before they'd be forced to leave?
So through the chair, that last call is not a concept used in on-site marijuana consumption. So certainly people are familiar with that in the liquor industry, but that's not one that has been discussed as part of the marijuana consumption.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may follow up, so then it would be possible if a place closes at 9, I mean, right before closing, a person could be served, and then that person would need to leave when it closes?
Yeah, through the chair, the way that the code is written today, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, if I may ask the health department, if the health department would be willing to, I don't know if you have a position developed yet on this ordinance, or if maybe you'd be willing to comment on the effect of the daily limit of 10 milligrams a day, and how that can affect individuals, and if there's a cumulative effect, and how that plays out in impairment. And maybe you're not prepared at this point to comment, but
we don't have something prepared on that today, but we certainly could put something for you.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Whittleton.
So your stats on fatalities related to AIDS, that's concerning really, but a couple of questions. So, you know, if there's a fatality and you check, you do a blood test, you look for alcohol and other stuff. So if you say OTHC, could it be, I mean, it stays in the system for some number of days. It could be they smoked pot 3 days before and it was not a factor in the crash, but it comes up. Is that possible?
Yes, it does stay in your system. If you're a current user or you're a casual user, it really depends. However, what we're looking for typically when we get the toxicology back is the active THC.
So it's a high number or low number?
Well, it doesn't matter. Just like this, carboxy THC is an inactive metabolite, whereas the delta 9 THC is an active drug. So when we get toxicology back, we actually get toxicology for the delta 9 and the carboxy. So it typically what we're looking for is the active drug, the active THC that's in their system.
Okay, so then that lasts 8 hours or something like that suggests it would be high.
No, actually it dissipates really quick. There's actually new studies out there that when they take their last puff, half the THC has been metabolized. So that's how fast it dissipates out of your system.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
My question is actually for Ms. Wilson. I'm trying to get a sense of this. Are there other on-site consumption places in the country that only do edibles? Are there examples that we could find that exists?
I don't have an example of that. I know Nevada just legalized their lounge venues, but they allow other types of consumption. But I don't know an example of edibles. I also wanted to correct myself. I don't think after looking at the regs and kind of texting back first, I think staff is right. I don't think there is a separate point of sale, just a mechanism of making sure that the products for on-site are separately categorized, so you're not bringing in other products into there. So I just wanted to correct that. But no, I don't think I have an example for just on-site edibles. But I could do some research.
And just one other question. I'm trying to get an idea of what limitations are for this space, and so I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. Is this a space that can allow music and a variety of types of entertainment? Is this a space that is really sort of confined in terms of what can occur within the space?
Yeah, through the chair, the meat of your question, or the answer to your question, is on pages 9 through, let me see, roughly 9 through 12 of the ordinance. And these are all the new provisions that we're adding to code as it relates to the consumption area and the allowable and prohibited act by an on-site consumption endorsement. You'll see that it's almost singularly focused on the product itself and the protections and prohibitions on the product, and that there are very few, if any, references to external activities and products other than to say that we don't want new marijuana or alcohol introduced to the area. So to answer, that's a long-winded way of saying, could they do music and things like that? The way I read this, yes. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is having a separate on-site consumption area with a band might be impossible. But piping music in, or having cool lighting, or video games, probably is doable.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question is to Ms. Waltzine, exactly kind of following up on Mr. Perez-Verdia's question. What does the industry contemplate these on-site consumption areas to be like?
For outside of the city of Anchorage, it was more meant to be in like a social gathering, so more like you come together and you play ping pong and games, basically just a social place. Because most people, the reason they want this is they don't want to be smoking inside their homes where their kids are around. And talking about the perceived risks of youth, like when youth see their parents consume marijuana, they might think it's not that big of a deal, and it's not that it's safe. And so a lot of parents are trying to kind of get away from that and not necessarily have their kids see them. To be honest with you, with this model, I think most people are thinking, okay, have a space where somebody can come in, a tourist, in the downtown area is really where this is popping up. Come in, take an edible, and then go and see a concert, or go to the farmer's market, or go to the fair. Those kinds of things. Not as much hang out, play a game, or anything like that.
So what kind of based on what we kind of currently licensed for facilities, retail establishments, what kind of square footage would we be looking at, initially for on-site consumption in endorsement areas? And I realize it varies, but these are ballpark. I mean, if we're talking 50 square feet, we're obviously talking something very small where there wouldn't be any entertainment or opportunity to really feel comfortable and hang out versus something much larger. Because especially in the downtown area, a lot of these places are hemmed in, and there's not going to be room to expand them physically.
I'll start and then let Ryan take up the tail end through the chair. So It's going to be site specific because any on-site consumption area eats into your on-site retail area. So if you only have a building that's 300 square feet, you're going to have a pretty small consumption area. Now, most retail establishments have a larger area than that, but Dankridge, for example, which was in the news recently, they have a very tiny footprint. They're going to have an interesting time developing an on-site consumption area. If I remember the news report, they're actually thinking about their roof as a potential location. So it's going to be site-specific, and then the only other thing I'll add to that is that there are certain building code provisions about minimum space for these kinds of gathering spaces. So there's two things at play here. There's what's your available gross floor area anyway, and then what's the minimum allowable under building code that's going to impact us. Additionally, there's probably some zoning code provisions that could impact it, right?
It could. I think the biggest factors that might limit the size would be an inability to meet the parking requirement, and also the fact that a lot of these facilities are located in smaller, older buildings that are just small. 3,000 square feet would be a large marijuana retail sales establishment. Most of these facilities are in the area between 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. So just to kind of put it in perspective, I'm going to take a wild guess here, but if you were to chop this room at about that pillar, it's probably 500, 600 square feet. So, what you can do with that amount of space, it just depends. It depends how they would like to operate their consumption area, whether they want it to be more of a social environment or whether they want it to be more of a get in, get out kind of situation.
It's true. And I'll just, in closing through the chair, and Mr. Welton probably could speak more to this, but from a retailer's perspective, having grown up in that industry, it's all about sort of merchandising. And many of the retail establishments, I haven't visited many, but of the few retail establishments I have visited, they don't make very good use of their retail space from a merchandising standpoint. So I think many of them can afford to take a much more condensed approach to the retail footprint if they would like to have this on-site consumption in their building.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Altel. So what we're going to do for the remainder of our time, I have two more questions on the queue, and then what I'd like to do is I'd like us to state any questions or queries we'd like our departments to do some research on in prep for the May 17th work session. So Mr. Weddleton.
Well, I'll skip my question then and just say I think more of the staff on what's changed since if you have anything on marijuana arrests or whatever for driving and stuff like that prior to legalization and after that would be good value.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
And you may not have the numbers in front of you, but what would you estimate are the percentage of in the retail store between what you would smoke and what you would eat? What would you say in terms of what people are selling?
Oh, like purchasing?
Yeah.
I would say probably eating would be 25%. Smoking would probably be 75%. You'll see that change as the market matures and as edibles get more better and cheaper.
Yeah.
To be blunt, they're really expensive. But that's the split I would see.
And this conversation, in some ways, is we're having the edible conversation because of the decision to sort of split these in half. But my assumption is that the industry isn't necessarily thinking in that way. Is the industry interested in on-site consumption for both, and not necessarily for just the edible part of it?
Well, so the industry has always been pretty understanding of that this is new and we need to ease into it, and I think we've all shown that we've been really good about being patient. So ideally, of course, we'd like it to be smoking and consumption of marijuana edibles. I think the police officer behind me made some really good points about how long edibles stay in your system, and that poses some concerns, and that poses concerns for the marijuana industry too. So smoking's more of a social thing, so of course we'd like to see that, but we're happy to start slow and just see the roots at first. Not happy, but okay.
And just the last, not sort of to that point, your point, officer, about the sort of time it takes to process the edible, and it would be great to have some more information on that, so that we can have a better sort of conversation about the on-site on-site consumption and just that reality of the difference between somebody who would smoke it and who would eat it, and how that would sort of, how long it would last in their system, and what kinds of public safety risks that may bring. So any information
Mr. Chair.
on that? Thank you.
To respond a little more to his question, and you may be in a better position than I, but in the last year, I think I read that Colorado, which has had a much longer experience with legalized marijuana, first with medical marijuana and then recreational, their stats are that people are buying quite a bit more in the way of edibles than smokable marijuana. And that has really exploded, I think, in just the last 3 years where that's changed. I don't know why that is, and I don't know if that's a trend in other states where it's legalized, but it could happen here as well.
It probably will happen here, because it happens in every state. It starts off being edible or smoking and concentrates, and then it phases over into the edible world.
And one of the things they told us down there, now this was like 3 years ago when I went down there for training, but with bud, smokable type marijuana, they had worked with hybrids and got the THC level up to 37%, but with different types of edibles, it's and wax and chatter and different things where it's highly purified but non-smokable, it was up to 90%. So it can have a pretty good wallow.
Thank you, Mr. Prosperdia. So do any assembly members have any other queries they'd like for the May 17th meeting?
Well, just if I might add to what Mr. Sherwood just said, although it is possible that those chemical compounds can be concentrated, the state has restricted legally concentrates and only allows up to 5% in the edibles here. So while it could be possible in a universe that they could, on an illegal market, find products that are more concentrated, it's only at the 5%.
Thank you. And while I have you, Mr. Constant, do you have any topics for the May 17th meeting, work session?
Yeah, just a refined data set from APD on that list of interactions that they had said were marijuana related. I would like to know if they were also polysubstance related, or how many were just marijuana.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Salatel.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to have some consideration or conversation around phase implementation. And I guess I would leave that kind of to the expertise of those who've been dealing with this to start. And so we can have something to maybe chew on at the next meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Salatel. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to mention something in this meeting that I mentioned at the committee meeting last week. I actually was flipping through the cable channels one night, and I came across a cooking show that was based 100% on what foods and dishes you could cook that were containing THC. And there were people on that show talking about opening restaurants in the state of California that were strictly themed with different types of food and entire meals, and with a menu that you could order different things off the menu that were infused with THC. So, you know, I do think the edibles thing is the direction that it's heading, because many people see smoking as unhealthful, and so if you do the edible thing, then you're probably not going to mess your lungs up as much as you might if you smoke.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Kennedy.
Well, I probably have all kinds of questions, but the main one right now is there any kind of an estimate in terms of what the projections might be of new sales with this? Has anybody, kind of figured out in the market this is going to increase purchase and use?
Thank you. Mr. Presbyterian.
Yeah, I'm interested in any information that we can get from the public safety enforcement part of it, from other states that have been doing this longer. If there are any sort of techniques or lessons learned in terms of what they have done to sort of manage the enforcement part of it. And I am really interested in any information about what's to come. When I did my ride-along, the officer I was talking with, he may not have known, but that, there is in the future something that is more concrete that like a the thing you blow into for alcohol, something that we would have that would tell us right away, and that we would move to a THC limit of some kind. So any information that we have about other states and what they're doing in enforcement, and any idea about what's to come in terms of enforcement, so we can be aware of that.
THC breathalyzer.
Yeah, THC breathalyzer. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdio. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to reiterate along the same lines as what other members have said in terms of statistics, arrests, and definitely convictions. And I'm interested in that data that Mr. Perez-Verdio mentioned about looking at other communities to see what strategies, techniques, or whatever can be used when it comes to enforcement. And then health considerations as far as how THC affects different individuals and how long it stays in the system. And we've asked the health department for that feedback. And then also some consideration about last call, or how much time an establishment should remain open depending on how long it's in the system, or what recommendation there might be for that, so that people aren't being asked to leave when they're in no shape to make decisions or drive. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Weddleton.
One last thing, I may be going to that because I'm worried about these people driving when they're high. I mean, it seems hard to do, but can we say you got to go in there with a friend who's going to be a designated driver? How you would work that in? It's pretty common in bars now. They don't require it. We're just starting out. This might be something to try.
To the chair, it's not a specific answer to your question, but the signage requirements for marijuana retail establishments and by extension on-site consumption areas are listed in code. And while it does not specify the designated driver posters that you see commonly at other licensees, we probably could get those as well for marijuana endorsements.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Thank you, Mr. Schutte. Last comment, Mr. Pearson.
Thank you. And we mentioned this at the committee meeting last week as well. When you're consuming through inhalation through smoking, the effect is more immediate. If you're eating it, it takes a half hour, an hour, hour and a half, depending on the person's system before it has any effect on them. So as far as the last call situation is concerned, you're actually better off having them consume right before you close, because it's not going to get into their system have an effect on them for another half hour, an hour, hour and a half, versus smoking, where it would have an immediate or almost immediate effect on them.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. So I want to close this work session by also adding one additional thing. Mr. Dunbar is not here, so I would be remiss if I didn't. He, at the various Community Economic Development Committee meetings, had some concerns about parking, and so that's one issue I'm sure he will want to discuss again. Then I just want to state that at our next work session on May 17th, we'll continue to work through this list, and if possible, we will have public participation at the May 17th work session. If not, there will be the public testimony on the May 21st Assembly meeting. With that, sure.
Sorry, just real quick, you didn't ask us what we're going to research.
Oh, sure.
There was an interesting discussion earlier about whether or not the point of sale has to be inside the consumption area or not. We have differing opinions, and we're going to clarify that with AMCO.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Specifically, if it's not separate, then do they designate them separately?
Right.
All right, thank you. So this work session is closed.